Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a part of the Indian Constitution that, honestly, usually flies right under the radar. We're talking about fundamental duties. Now, for decades, we focused heavily, and rightly so, on our fundamental rights. But what happens when we flip the coin and look at the other side?
Really think about it for a second. Can you truly have rights without responsibilities? Is it actually possible to just demand privileges and freedoms without first putting in the effort or acknowledging your obligations to the very society that grants them? Well, that is the philosophical core of our topic today, and it really sets the stage for a massive shift in how we view citizenship. Mahatma Gandhi actually hit the nail on the head with this one. He once said, "The true source of rights is duty. If we all discharge our duties, rights will not be far to seek." He deeply believed that if we just prioritize our responsibilities, the rights we desire are just naturally going to follow. But if we abandon our duties and only chase our rights, well, those rights will constantly evade us.
So, Section 1, Rights and their source. Let's take a look at how this balancing act actually plays out in the real world, and something we experience every single day.
Think of this whole concept like a family dynamic. Imagine you're the younger sibling in a house, right? You want your pocket money, you want your tuition paid, and you're actively demanding that your parents buy you a brand new motorcycle. Now, those are your so-called rights in the house. But what if you're completely ignoring the fundamental rules of that house? What if you're disrespecting your parents or your elder siblings? You can't simply enjoy your rights and make all these demands if you aren't fulfilling your basic responsibilities to the household. It's the same with the country. Rights and duties, they're totally correlated. They have to walk hand in hand.
All right, Section 2, the Cold War origins. Let's trace exactly where this concept came from, because, and this might surprise you, these duties were nowhere to be found in the original 1950 Constitution.
Yep, when the Constitution was first adopted back in 1950, there wasn't a single mention of fundamental duties. For over 25 years, the Constitution was all about fundamental rights and directive principles. But then, things got really turbulent in the mid-1970s. In 1974, you had the JP movement, also known as the Bihar movement, led by Jayaprakash Narayan. This sparked massive, widespread student protests and anti-corruption rallies directed squarely at the state and central governments. Following all this political chaos, a national emergency was declared from June 1975 all the way to March 1977. And it was exactly during this intense, 18-month period that the government decided, okay, it's time to rethink the balance of citizen power and introduce a formal code of duties.
Now, what's genuinely fascinating here is the global context during that Cold War era. At the time, major developed democracies, like the USA and Germany, they focused almost entirely on individual rights and sovereignty. Over in the West, the individual came first, absolutely. But India was closely allied with the USSR, and in the Soviet Union's socialist model, the state was everything. All property was public, and the citizen's duty to the state took absolute precedence, sometimes even overriding individual rights. So, observing this Soviet model, along with the strict civic disciplines seen in countries like Japan, India decided to borrow this concept. The goal was to give equal, balanced importance to both rights and duties.
So, right in the middle of the emergency, the government formed the Swaran Singh Committee to figure out a set of duties. Based on the recommendations, the massive 42nd Amendment was passed in 1976, injecting 10 fundamental duties straight into the Constitution. And get this, it's a really telling fact. Despite heavy opposition at the time, when new governments came into power and actively reversed a bunch of other emergency-era laws through the 43rd and 44th Amendments, they didn't touch the fundamental duties. No, they actually kept them. And later on in 2002, under the 86th Amendment, they even added an 11th duty.
Moving on to Section 3, the Code of Duties. So, what exactly are these rules we're all supposed to follow? Let's break down the actual code. They were dropped into a brand new chapter, Part IVA of the Constitution, which is literally just a single article, Article 51A. Now, there is a crucial absolute must-know distinction here. These duties are explicitly 100% confined to citizens. If a foreign tourist flies in to visit the Andaman Islands for a quick 2-week vacation, you cannot force them to fulfill these constitutional duties. The whole shebang is the exclusive responsibility of the Indian citizen.
Okay, so the first cluster of these 11 duties really focuses on our national and social obligations. It mandates that we abide by the Constitution, respect its institutions, the national flag, and the national anthem. We have to cherish the noble ideals of our unique freedom struggle. We're called to protect the sovereignty and unity of India and, of course, defend the country when called upon.
Crucially, though, we must promote harmony and a genuine spirit of common brotherhood, actively rising above any religious, linguistic, or regional differences we might have.
The next set is honestly quite unique when you look globally. We are duty-bound to preserve our rich composite cultural heritage. Basically, don't deface ancient monuments. We absolutely must protect our natural environment, forests, and wildlife. And what's truly beautiful here is the specific mention of having compassion for living creatures, like taking a moment to feed a stray, hungry animal that wanders up to your door. The code also explicitly requires citizens to develop a scientific temper. This means embracing logic, humanism, and a spirit of inquiry, rather than just blindly following superstitions. You know, like believing there are ghosts under a peepal tree at night, rather than just understanding the science of carbon dioxide. And naturally, we must safeguard public property and strictly avoid violence.
Finally, we're asked to strive towards excellence in all individual and collective activities. Just think of the massive collective effort of ISRO scientists pushing the entire nation to higher achievements in space exploration. And then there's that final 11th duty, the one added in 2002. It places a direct obligation on parents or guardians to provide opportunities for education to their children between the ages of 6 and 14.
All right, let's pivot to Section 4, what was left out, because honestly, looking at the rejected proposals is just as fascinating as seeing what actually made the final cut. The Swaran-Singh Committee actually wanted to go quite a bit further.
The committee boldly recommended that Parliament should have the power to impose strict penalties or even punishments if a citizen failed to comply with these duties. They also suggested that any law enforcing these punishments couldn't even be challenged in court, not even if it seemingly violated a fundamental right. Plus, they wanted to make paying taxes a strict, no-excuses, fundamental duty. But the government ultimately rejected these ideas. You have to remember, at the time, India was very much a developing nation with a pretty small tax base. Making these duties punishable offenses right out of the gate, that was just deemed way too harsh.
And, you know, the criticism didn't stop there. Legal heavyweights like D.D. Chawla, who chaired the National Forum of Lawyers, came down hard on the wording. He argued that the duties were highly ambiguous and just way too difficult for the everyday person to grasp. Take the phrase, noble ideals of the freedom struggle. That is entirely subjective. Depending on your personal political views, your idea of a noble ideal might be Gandhi's strict nonviolence, or it might be Bhagat Singh's revolutionary actions. It's a notoriously vague term that is incredibly hard to pin down in a legal sense.
So, the crucial point raised by critics, which even included a former attorney general, was that this entire chapter might just be, well, superfluous. The main argument was that, look, 99.9% of citizens are already good, law-abiding people. They pay their taxes, they love their country. Adding a long list of moral rules to the Constitution just to target a tiny fraction of antisocial elements just felt unnecessary to a lot of folks, especially since they were tucked away in Part IV, making them feel almost like an afterthought to the directive principles rather than carrying the real weight of fundamental rights.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 5, the bark versus bite. Let's look at how we actually enforce these duties and how these seemingly toothless moral guidelines actually pack a massive legal bite today. So, strictly on paper, fundamental duties are what we call non-justiciable. Basically, this means you cannot be dragged directly into court merely because you failed to show a scientific temper. But, and this is a huge but, that does not mean they are powerless. Parliament is fully empowered to pass specific legislative acts to enforce these exact duties. And over the years, let me tell you, they have done exactly that. The Justice Verma Committee really highlighted just how deeply entrenched these duties are in our legal system. For example, your duty to respect the national flag and anthem, that is strictly legally enforced by the Prevention of Insults to National Honor Act. Your duty to protect the environment? Well, that's backed by the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which makes keeping endangered species as pets, even certain native parrots, a strict punishable crime. And your duty to promote brotherhood? That's reflected in the Representation of the People Act, which can literally disqualify a politician if they try seeking votes based on religion, race, or language.
And on top of all that, we have some real heavy-hitting frameworks. Think about the Indian Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code, which actively punish anyone encouraging enmity between different groups, effectively enforcing our duty of harmony. The Protection of Civil Rights Act directly punishes untouchability offenses, and the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, or UAPA, can ban entire organizations if they spread communal hatred. These acts essentially serve as the hidden enforcement arm of Article 51A.
But here is where they get their ultimate absolute power. The Supreme Court ruled back in 1992 that fundamental duties can actually be used to determine if a brand new law is constitutionally valid. So if the government passes a law that restricts your individual freedoms, say banning you from entering a sensitive protected forest reserve, the courts will uphold that restriction as totally reasonable. Why? Because that law is directly serving your fundamental duty to protect the natural environment. Your duties, therefore, provide the actual legal justification for the state to establish order.
So we've seen how a concept born out of the tensions of the Cold War and the emergency era evolved into this absolutely crucial pillar of the Indian legal system. They are reminders, sure. They are inspirations, absolutely. But yes, they are also legally binding through parliamentary law. So the next time you think about your freedoms, I want to leave you with this one thought. Are we simply demanding our rights, or are we actively fulfilling the fundamental duties that make this whole democratic balance possible in the first place? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep exploring.